The echoing crack of a gunshot split the morning air as Clara Edwards ducked behind an overturned wagon, her wedding dress torn and mudded at the hem. Her heart hammered against her ribs, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks as she clutched a small leather satchel to her chest. She had been on the run since dawn, fleeing from the very altar where she was supposed to pledge her life to a man she despised, a man her family had forced upon her. "Miss, are you hurt?" The deep voice startled her, and she whirled around to find herself staring into the concerned blue eyes of a stranger. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, a Stetson pushed back on his head revealing sandy brown hair. Dust covered his boots and chaps, marking him as a working cowboy. "They'll be coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My husband's men, they'll drag me back." The cowboy's gaze swept across the horizon before settling back on her. "Who's coming, madam, and why are they chasing a bride on her wedding day?" Clara's fingers tightened around the satchel. "They forced me to marry him," she said, her voice breaking. "My father sold me to settle his debts. The ceremony finished, but I ran before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Something hardened in the cowboy's expression. He stood taller, his shoulders squaring. "Then you'll choose for yourself from now on," he said with quiet conviction. "My name's Bryce Yates. My horse is just beyond those trees. Can you ride? Wyoming Territory, 1875. The harsh landscape that had broken so many souls had forged others into steel. Clara had never imagined herself as steel. She'd been raised to be a proper lady, soft-spoken and obedient. But as she mounted the cowboy's horse, her torn wedding dress bunched awkwardly around her legs, she felt something new awakening inside her. "Where are we heading?" she asked as Bryce swung up behind her, one arm reaching around her waist to take the reins. "My family's ranch is about 6 hours' ride," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "It's not much, but you'll be safe there until we figure things out." Clara nodded, acutely aware of his chest pressing against her back, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat a stark contrast to her own racing pulse. "I don't have anything to offer you in return," she said softly. "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Edwards. No decent man could stand by while a woman is treated as property." As they rode away from the settlement, Clara watched the dust cloud of her pursuers growing on the horizon behind them. She had never met this cowboy before today, never even imagined a man like him existed, one who would risk everything to help a stranger based on principle alone. The vastness of the Wyoming prairie stretched before them, golden grass swaying in the breeze under an endless blue sky. For the first time in her 20 years, Clara felt the intoxicating taste of freedom, even as danger followed close behind. 6 hours on horseback felt like an eternity. Clara's body ached in places she never knew could hurt. The elegant wedding dress that had cost her father, or more accurately, her new husband, a small fortune, was beyond ruined. The white satin now brown with dust, torn at the seams, and spotted with blood from where thorns had caught her during their hasty escape. "Just over this ridge," Bryce said, his voice a reassuring rumble against her back. "You'll see the ranch soon." True to his word, as they crested the hill, a sprawling homestead came into view. It wasn't the grandest ranch Clara had ever seen, but it was substantial, a main house built of sturdy logs, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. "Your family must be successful," she observed. "We work hard," he replied simply. "My father started with nothing 20 years ago. Now we run close to 500 head of cattle." As they approached the ranch, a woman emerged from the house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in her brown hair, wearing a practical cotton dress and an apron. "Bryce Yates," she called out. "You were supposed to be back yesterday with those supplies, and here you are with—" She stopped short, taking in Clara's bedraggled appearance and torn wedding dress. Good heavens, what happened? Bryce dismounted and helped Clara down, his strong hands encircling her waist momentarily before setting her gently on her feet. "Ma, this is Miss Clara Edwards. She needs our help." Bertha Yates, for that was Bryce's mother's name, took one look at Clara's frightened eyes and torn dress and made an immediate decision. Come inside, dear. Let's get you cleaned up and into something more practical. Bryce, fetch some water for the bath. Your father will be back from the north pasture soon, and he'll need to know what's happening. Inside, the ranch house was simple but comfortable. Handmade quilts adorned the furniture, and the wooden floors gleamed with years of careful polishing. Clara felt immediately at ease despite her circumstances. Now, Mrs. Yates said once they were alone in the kitchen, tell me what's brought you here in such a state. Clara's hands trembled as she accepted a cup of hot tea. My father, he's always gambled. He finally wagered more than he could afford to lose. She took a shaky breath. The winner was Walter Green, the cattle baron from Sweetwater. Instead of claiming our ranch, he claimed me, said he needed a wife to give him sons. Mrs. Yates's face darkened. And your father agreed to this. He had no choice, he said. Mr. Green would have taken everything otherwise. Clara stared into her tea. The wedding was this morning. I said the vows with a gun at my father's back, but when everyone was celebrating afterward, I slipped away. I couldn't bear to. Her voice broke. The older woman reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. You don't need to say more, dear. No woman should be bartered like cattle. Your son found me hiding behind an overturned wagon. Mr. Green's men were searching the town for me. She looked up, her blue eyes filled with fear. They'll come here, won't they, once they figure out where I've gone? Perhaps, Mrs. Yates said thoughtfully, but the Yates family has never backed down from doing what's right, no matter the cost. She stood decisively. Now, let's get you out of that dress and into something sensible. If you're going to be on a ranch, you can't be tripping over satin and lace. An hour later, Clara emerged from a blissfully hot bath, dressed in a borrowed cotton shirt, simple skirt, and sturdy boots that were slightly too large but serviceable when stuffed with paper at the toes. Her long chestnut hair, freed from its elaborate wedding style, hung in damp waves down her back. Bryce was seated at the kitchen table with a tall, weathered man who could only be his father. Both men stood when she entered. Miss Edwards, the older man said, inclining his head. I'm Benjamin Yates. My son tells me you're in some trouble. Yes, sir, Clara replied, suddenly feeling small under his scrutiny. And I've brought that trouble to your doorstep. I'm truly sorry. Benjamin's stern expression softened slightly. No need for apologies. No woman should be forced into marriage, and no decent man would enforce such an arrangement. You can stay as long as you need to. Relief flooded through her. Thank you, Mr. Yates. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness. Well, we can always use another pair of hands around here, Mrs. Yates said practically. Can you cook? Clara nodded. Yes, madam, and so I was educated to run a household. Good, then you'll earn your keep while you're here, she smiled warmly. Now you must be starving. Sit down and have some supper. As Clara took her place at the table, she couldn't help noticing how Bryce watched her, his blue eyes thoughtful. When he caught her looking, he gave her a small smile that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. For the first time since her father had announced her impending marriage 2 weeks ago, Clara felt something other than dread and despair. It might have been hope, though she scarcely dared name it. 3 days passed in relative peace. Clara quickly fell into the rhythm of ranch life, rising before dawn to help Mrs. Yates prepare breakfast for the men before they headed out to work the cattle. The physical labor of churning butter, kneading bread, and scrubbing laundry was a welcome distraction from her fears, and the ache in her muscles at day's end helped her sleep despite her worries. Bryce was often gone from sunrise to sunset, but Clara found her gaze drawn to him whenever he was near. There was something compelling about the quiet confidence with which he moved, the gentle way he treated the horses, and his unfailing politeness to her. He never pushed for details about her marriage or questioned her decisions, simply accepting her presence as if she belonged there. On the 4th morning, Clara was gathering eggs in the henhouse when she heard the sound of approaching horses. A lot of horses. She peered through the small window and felt her blood turn to ice. At least a dozen men were riding toward the ranch house, and at their lead was a figure she recognized instantly. Walter Green, the man she had fled from at the altar. Clara dropped her basket, eggs shattering on the dirt floor as she ran toward the house. Mrs. Yates, she called out. They're here, Bertha Yates appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the approaching riders. "Get inside, Clara," she said firmly, "and fetch the shotgun from above the mantel." Clara obeyed, her hands shaking as she retrieved the weapon. Through the window, she watched the riders halt in the yard. Walter Green dismounted, his expensive suit and polished boots looking out of place on the working ranch. He was a large man, well over 40, with a thick mustache and cold eyes that had made Clara shudder when he'd lifted her veil at the wedding. "Mrs. Yates," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I believe you're harboring my wife. I've come to collect her." Bertha stood her ground on the porch, the shotgun now visible in her hands. "There's no one here by that description, Mr. Green, just family." Green's face darkened. "Don't play games with me, woman. My men tracked her here. Clara Edwards is my lawfully wedded wife, and I demand you turn her over immediately." "The name's Clara Edwards, not Clara Green," Bertha replied evenly, "and the only demand I recognize on my property is the law." "Do you have a warrant, sir?" "I don't need a warrant to claim my own wife." Green's voice rose in anger. "Actually, you do," came a new voice. Clara's heart leapt as Bryce rode into the yard, followed by his father and 3 ranch hands. They must have seen the riders approaching from the pasture. "This is private property, Mr. Green, and unless you have legal papers, I suggest you leave." Green turned to face the newcomers, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. "This isn't your concern, boy. The woman is mine by law and by right. Her father accepted my offer, the preacher pronounced us man and wife, and I have witnesses to prove it." "Did she say I do of her own free will?" Bryce asked, dismounting and walking toward Green. "Or did you force her?" "What she wants is irrelevant," Green sneered. The law requires consent," Benjamin Yates interrupted, joining his son. "And a marriage unconsummated can be annulled. I assume that's the case since the lady ran before you could claim your rights." The last word dripped with contempt. Clara watched from the window, her heart pounding. Bryce stood tall and unafraid, though he was outnumbered. The ranch hands had spread out, hands near their weapons, creating a protective barrier between the house and Green's men. "This is your last warning," Green said, his voice deadly quiet. "Give me my wife, or I'll burn this place to the ground." "You can try," Benjamin replied, "but the Yates family has faced worse than you and survived. I suggest you reconsider." For a tense moment, Clara thought violence would erupt in the yard. Then, unexpectedly, Green laughed. "Very well. If that's how you want to play it." He turned and mounted his horse. "I'll be back with the sheriff and enough men to make you regret this decision. The woman is mine, and I always claim what's mine." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. As soon as they were gone, Clara burst out of the house and ran to where Bryce and his father stood watching the retreating dust cloud. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears filling her eyes. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your family. I should leave before he returns." Bryce turned to her, his expression gentle but determined. "And go where, Miss Edwards? Green has money and influence throughout the territory. He'd find you." "He's right," Benjamin said. "Besides, we Yateses don't abandon people who need help. That's not our way." "But he'll come back with the sheriff," Clara protested. "Sheriff Matthews is a fair man," Bryce assured her. "He won't simply hand you over without hearing your side, and he knows as well as anyone that a marriage forced at gunpoint isn't binding in the eyes of God or the law." "In the meantime," Benjamin said, "we should prepare for trouble. Bryce, ride to the Hartley and Wilson ranches. Tell them what's happening and ask if they can spare a few men. Green isn't the only one with friends in this territory." Bryce nodded and turned to Clara. "Don't worry. We won't let him take you." The sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. In that moment, standing in the dusty ranch yard with danger looming on the horizon, Clara realized she was falling in love with this man, who had risked everything to help her, a stranger who had literally ridden into his life in a torn wedding dress. The realization terrified her almost as much as the threat of Walter Green's return. That evening, tension hung heavy in the Yates household. Benjamin had posted guards around the property, and the hands took turns keeping watch from the barn roof, which offered the best vantage point. Bryce had returned from the neighboring ranches with promises of support, and several additional cowboys now bolstered their defenses. Clara sat at the kitchen table, mending one of Bryce's shirts by lamplight. Her hands moved automatically with needle and thread while her mind raced with worries. "You have a gift for fine stitching," Mrs. Yates commented, looking up from the bread dough she was kneading for the next day's meals. "My mother insisted I learn," Clara replied. "She said a woman's worth was measured by her household skills." Mrs. Yates murmured disapprovingly. "There's more to a woman's worth than how well she can sew or cook, though those are useful skills to have," Clara smiled faintly. "My mother would disagree. She always told me my only purpose was to make a good marriage. And is that what you want from life?" The older woman's gaze was penetrating. Clara considered the question. Until a few days ago, she had never really thought about what she wanted. Her life had been a series of expectations and obligations, leading inevitably to marriage and children. Running from Walter Green had been an act of desperate self-preservation, not a carefully considered life choice. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I never believed I had choices." Mrs. Yates wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and sat down across from Clara. "Everyone has choices, dear. Sometimes they're difficult ones with steep consequences, but they're choices nonetheless. Like the one your son made when he decided to help me," Clara asked softly. The older woman's eyes twinkled. "Bryce has always had a strong sense of justice. But I've never seen him quite so, invested in doing the right thing." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "He's been very kind. Kind, yes, and something more, I think." Mrs. Yates patted Clara's hand. "I've raised 3 boys, and I know when one of them is smitten." Before Clara could respond, the door opened and Bryce entered, bringing with him the cool night air and the scent of horses and leather. His eyes immediately found Clara, and the smile that crossed his face confirmed his mother's observation. "Any sign of trouble?" Mrs. Yates asked her son. "All quiet so far," Bryce replied, removing his hat. "But Green will be back. Men like him don't take kindly to being refused." "We'll face that when it comes," his mother said practically. "For now, you need food and rest. Clara, would you dish up some stew for Bryce while I finish this bread?" Clara nodded and rose, acutely aware of Bryce watching her as she moved to the stove. She ladled the rich beef stew into a bowl and placed it on the table along with a chunk of yesterday's bread. "Thank you," he said, their fingers brushing as she handed him a spoon. The brief contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. "It's the least I can do," she replied, resuming her seat across from him. "Your family has risked everything for me." Bryce took a bite of stew before answering. "We're doing what's right, that's all." Still, not many would stand against Walter Green. He's one of the most powerful men in the territory. "Power doesn't make him right," Bryce said firmly, "and it doesn't give him the right to force a woman into marriage." Clara studied his face in the lamplight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he looked at her. So different from Walter Green's cold, possessive stare. "May I ask you something, Mr. Yates?" "Bryce," he corrected gently, "and yes, you may ask me anything. Why aren't you married? She hesitated, suddenly embarrassed. "You seem like you'd make a good husband." A slight smile curved his lips. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, or maybe I was waiting without knowing it." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a possibility. Mrs. Yates cleared her throat softly, reminding them of her presence, but her expression was knowing and not at all disapproving. The moment was broken by the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Bryce was on his feet instantly, hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Stay inside," he ordered, striding to the door. Clara and Mrs. Yates watched anxiously as he stepped onto the porch. Through the window, Clara saw one of the ranch hands dismount, breathing hard as if he'd ridden fast with urgent news. When Bryce came back inside, his expression was grave. "Green's gathering men in town, at least 20 hired guns. They're planning to ride out at first light. Mrs. Yates pressed her lips together. "Benjamin won't be back from the North Range until tomorrow evening. We have 8 men here, plus the 5 Wilsons sent over," Bryce calculated. "It might be enough if we use the terrain to our advantage." Or it might be a bloodbath, Clara said, rising from her seat. I won't have people dying for me. I should leave before dawn, draw them away from the ranch. Absolutely not, Bryce said firmly. Green would catch you before noon. Then what do you suggest? Clara demanded, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. I won't be responsible for your family getting hurt. Bryce ran a hand through his hair, thinking. There's another option. We could go to Judge Parker in Fort Smith. He's known for his strict interpretation of the law. If we can convince him your marriage was forced, he might grant an annulment immediately. Fort Smith is 3 days' hard ride, Mrs. Yates pointed out. If we leave tonight and push the horses, we could make it in 2, Bryce countered. Green would expect us to head west toward the mountains if we were running. He wouldn't immediately think to look east. Clara considered the plan. It was risky, but it offered a legitimate solution rather than just prolonging the inevitable confrontation. I'll go, she decided, but just me. You stay and defend your home, Bryce shook his head. You don't know the way and the trails are dangerous. I'm going with you. Both of you should go, Mrs. Yates said decisively. I'll tell the men Green is expected. They can make a show of defending the ranch, make it look like you're still here. That might buy you enough time to reach Fort Smith. Clara looked between mother and son, seeing the same determination in both faces. These people who barely knew her were willing to risk everything to help her secure her freedom. The realization was humbling and overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered, unable to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Pack only what you need, Mrs. Yates instructed. You'll have to travel light and fast. An hour later, Clara stood in the yard dressed in men's clothing borrowed from Bryce's youngest brother, who was closest to her size. Her hair was tucked up under a hat, and a bandana covered the lower half of her face. From a distance, she might pass for a young cowhand. Bryce led 2 of the ranch's fastest horses from the stable, already saddled and loaded with minimal supplies: jerky, hardtack, coffee, ammunition, and bedrolls. He had changed into dark clothing that would blend with the night. Ready. He asked softly as he helped her mount. Clara nodded, though her heart was racing with fear and uncertainty. She had never ridden such a distance, and the prospect of 2 days in the saddle was daunting. But the alternative, returning to Walter Green, was unthinkable. Mrs. Yates came out to the yard, carrying a small package wrapped in oilskin. Extra food, she explained, handing it to Bryce. And this. She pressed something small and metallic into Clara's hand, a simple gold band. My mother's wedding ring. If anyone asks, you're Mr. and Mrs. Smith, traveling to visit family. A woman alone with a man would draw attention. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, touched by the gesture. I'll return it to you, I promise. See that you do, Mrs. Yates said with a smile, and bring my son back safely. With a final farewell, they rode out into the darkness, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main trails. Clara followed Bryce's lead, trusting him to guide them safely through the night. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky, offering just enough light to navigate by. As the ranch disappeared behind them, Clara felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choices, determining her own fate even if that fate remained uncertain. They rode in silence for several hours, pushing the horses as much as they dared in the darkness. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they had covered considerable ground. We'll rest here for an hour, Bryce said, guiding them toward a small creek sheltered by cottonwood trees. The horses need water, and we should eat something. Clara dismounted stiffly, her legs trembling from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Bryce caught her arm as she stumbled, steadying her with a gentle touch. Are you all right? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Just sore, she admitted. I've never ridden this far before, he smiled sympathetically. It gets easier. By the time we reach Fort Smith, you'll be a seasoned rider. While Bryce tended to the horses, Clara gathered dry sticks for a small fire. The morning air was crisp, and her fingers were numb with cold despite the gloves she wore. Better not, Bryce said when he saw what she was doing. Smoke might be visible for miles. We'll eat cold rations and save the fire for nightfall. They sat side by side against a fallen log, sharing jerky and hardtack washed down with water from the creek. Dawn painted the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold, revealing a landscape of rolling prairie stretching toward distant mountains. "It's beautiful," Clara murmured, watching the sun crest the horizon. "That it is," Bryce agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found him looking at her rather than the sunrise. She ducked her head, suddenly shy. "Tell me about Fort Smith. What is this judge like?" "Judge Parker has a reputation for being tough but fair," Bryce explained. "They call him the hanging judge because he doesn't hesitate to sentence murderers to death, but he's also known for protecting the rights of women and Indians when others wouldn't." "Do you think he'll help me?" "I believe he will," Bryce said confidently. "Forced marriages violate both law and moral principle. With your testimony and perhaps a sworn statement from my mother about your condition when you arrived, I think he'll grant the annulment." Clara nodded, trying to imagine a future where she was truly free, not belonging to her father or to Walter Green. The possibility seemed almost too wonderful to contemplate. "And after?" she asked softly. "What happens after the annulment?" Bryce was quiet for a moment, breaking a piece of hardtack between his fingers. "That would be your choice," he said finally. "You could return to your family or, she prompted when he didn't continue, his blue eyes met hers, serious and sincere, "or you could come back to the ranch. We always need help, and my mother has grown fond of you. You'd be welcome for as long as you wanted to stay." The offer touched her deeply. "And what about you, Bryce Yates? Have you grown fond of me too?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I think you know the answer to that, Miss Edwards." Before she could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both freeze. Bryce was on his feet instantly, pulling Clara up beside him. Riders coming. Could be Green's men. He led her quickly to the horses. "No time to erase our tracks, we'll have to outrun them." They mounted swiftly and set off at a gallop, following the creek for a mile, before veering east across the open prairie. Clara clung to her saddle, her heart pounding with fear as she pushed her horse to keep pace with Bryce's. A glance over her shoulder confirmed her worst fears. At least 4 riders were visible on the horizon behind them, and they were gaining. "They have fresher horses," Bryce called to her. "We need to find cover." Ahead, the rolling prairie gave way to more rugged terrain, rocky outcroppings, and scattered pines that offered the possibility of concealment. Bryce led them toward a particularly dense cluster of rocks and trees. "Dismount here," he ordered when they reached the shelter. "We'll have to make a stand." Clara slid from her horse, legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. Bryce quickly tied the animals to a pine tree and drew his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay low and out of sight," he told her, positioning himself behind a large boulder that provided a good view of their back trail. "If things go badly, take my horse and keep heading east. Follow the North Star at night and you'll reach Fort Smith eventually." "I'm not leaving you," Clara said firmly, moving to crouch beside him. "Do you have another gun?" Bryce looked at her in surprise. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me. He wanted a son, but he got me instead, so he may do." She held out her hand expectantly. After a moment's hesitation, Bryce withdrew a revolver from his belt and passed it to her. 6 shots. Make them count." The riders were close now, spread out as they approached the rocks. Clara could see that they weren't Green's men at all, but rather 4 Indians on paint ponies, armed with rifles. "Cheyenne," Bryce murmured. "Stay calm, they might just be passing through." But it was clear the Indians had spotted their tracks. They circled closer, rifles ready but not yet aimed at the rocks where Clara and Bryce hid. One of the warriors, wearing a distinctive eagle feather in his long black hair, called out something in his native language. "What did he say?" Clara whispered. "I don't know much Cheyenne," Bryce admitted, "but I think he's asking who's there." Bryce stood slowly, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground rather than at the warriors, a deliberate show of caution rather than aggression. "We're just passing through," he called out. "We mean no harm." The leader studied them for a long moment, then replied in halting English, "Why you hide? Why woman dress as man?" Clara stepped forward despite Bryce's attempt to keep her behind him. She removed her hat, letting her long hair fall free. "We're being pursued by bad men," she explained. "Men who want to force me to marry their leader." This seemed to interest the Cheyenne. The leader conferred briefly with his companions before addressing Clara again. "White man's law's strange. Cheyenne woman chooses husband, not forced." I wish that were true for all women, Clara replied sincerely. The leader considered this, then made a decision. He gestured to the east. Bad men come, many horses, you come with us, hide better place. Bryce and Clara exchanged glances. Trusting themselves to the Cheyenne was risky, but if Green's men were indeed closing in, they had few options. We accept your help, Bryce said, lowering his rifle completely. Thank you. The leader nodded and motioned for them to mount. Follow no trail. They rode hard for several hours, the Cheyenne leading them through terrain that seemed designed to confuse pursuers across rocky ground that left no tracks, through shallow streams, and between rock formations that provided cover from distant observers. By midday, they had entered a region of steep ravines and hidden valleys that Clara had never imagined existed in Wyoming. Finally, they descended into a well-concealed valley where a small Cheyenne camp was situated beside a clear stream. Perhaps 20 lodges stood in a circle, with women working outside and children playing among the tipis. Horses grazed in a natural corral formed by the valley walls. The arrival of Bryce and Clara caused considerable interest. Women paused in their work to stare, and children ran alongside the horses, pointing and chattering excitedly. The leader, who had introduced himself as Black Hawk during their journey, escorted them to a large tipi in the center of the camp. Chief Red Cloud, he explained. He decide if you stay. They dismounted, stiff and exhausted from the hard ride. Clara's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and Bryce steadied her with a hand at her elbow. The simple touch was reassuring in this unfamiliar environment. The chief emerged from his lodge, a tall, dignified man with graying hair and penetrating dark eyes. He wore a simple buckskin shirt adorned with porcupine quills, and his bearing spoke of natural authority. Black Hawk explained their situation in the Cheyenne language, gesturing toward Clara several times during his account. The chief listened impassively, his gaze shifting between the two white strangers. When Black Hawk finished, Red Cloud addressed them in surprisingly good English. My son says you flee from men who would force this woman into marriage. Yes, sir, Bryce confirmed respectfully. We're trying to reach Fort Smith where a judge can declare the marriage invalid. Marriage should be sacred bond, Red Cloud said, his eyes on Clara, not chains. Among my people, woman has voice in who she marries. That is wise, Clara replied. I wish my own father shared your view. Something like approval flickered in the chief's eyes. You stay tonight, rest. Tomorrow, Black Hawk guide you safer path to Fort Smith. Relief washed over Clara. Thank you, Chief Red Cloud. We're grateful for your help. The chief nodded and spoke to a young woman who stood nearby. She approached Clara with a shy smile and motioned for her to follow. Go with Yellow Bird, Red Cloud instructed. She give you woman's clothes, man's clothes not fit you well. Clara glanced at Bryce, reluctant to be separated from him in this unfamiliar place. It's all right, he assured her. These people have shown us nothing but kindness. With a nod, Clara followed Yellow Bird to a nearby tipi where several women were working on tanning hides. They welcomed her with curious smiles and immediately began helping her change out of the two large men's clothing into a simple buckskin dress adorned with beadwork. They combed her tangled hair and braided it, chattering among themselves in their language. Despite the language barrier, Clara felt an unexpected kinship with these women. They worked with purpose and pride, their lives harder but somehow freer than the constrained existence she had known in civilized society. When she emerged from the tipi in her new attire, she found Bryce deep in conversation with Black Hawk and several other warriors. He looked up as she approached, and the admiration in his eyes made her cheeks warm. You look. He seemed at a loss for words. Beautiful, he finally managed. The women around Clara giggled at his obvious appreciation, nudging each other and making comments she couldn't understand, but could certainly interpret from their knowing smiles. That evening, they were guests of honor at a feast. Clara sat beside Bryce as various dishes were passed around roasted buffalo meat, some kind of stew with wild roots and berries, and flat bread that reminded her of the biscuits her mother used to make. The chief said Green's men rode within a mile of this valley today, Bryce told her quietly. They're searching for us, but they don't know this area like the Cheyenne do. Will we be safe traveling tomorrow? Clara asked, worry creasing her brow. Black Hawk knows paths that white men never use, he assured her. He'll get us to Fort Smith without being seen. As they ate, an elderly woman of the tribe approached and sat across from them, studying Clara intently. After a moment, she began to speak, her voice cracking with age. Yellow Bird, who had been sitting nearby, translated. Grandmother says she sees great courage in you. Like the eagle who flies against the wind, Clara smiled, touched by the old woman's words. Tell her I'm grateful, but I don't feel very courageous. Mostly I'm afraid. When this was translated, the old woman laughed and spoke again. She says courage is not absence of fear, Yellow Bird explained. Courage is action despite fear, she says. Yellow Bird hesitated, glancing at Bryce. She says the man beside you has courage too, and his heart speaks loudly when he looks at you, even when his mouth is silent. Clara felt her face flush and didn't dare look at Bryce, though she was acutely aware of him shifting beside her. The old woman wasn't finished. She pointed to Clara's hand, then to Bryce's, speaking rapidly. Grandmother is wise in matters of the heart, Yellow Bird translated carefully. She says two eagles who fly together against the wind become stronger than one alone. She offers to perform marriage ceremony in Cheyenne way if you wish it. Clara's eyes widened in surprise, and now she did look at Bryce, finding him equally startled by the suggestion. Please thank your grandmother, Bryce said, recovering first, but we haven't yet spoken of marriage ourselves. When Yellow Bird translated this, the old woman cackled and made a dismissive gesture, speaking once more. Grandmother says eyes have spoken, even if mouths have not, Yellow Bird said with a small smile. But she understands. The offer remains if you change your minds. After the feast, Clara found herself sitting alone by one of the cooking fires, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The day's events swirled in her mind: the desperate flight from the ranch, the pursuit, the unexpected sanctuary among the Cheyenne. May I join you? Bryce's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She nodded, making room for him on the buffalo robe where she sat. For a while they were silent, both contemplating the flames. Did you mean what you said to the old woman? Clara asked finally. About us not having spoken of marriage, Bryce turned to look at her, his expression serious in the firelight. I meant that I wouldn't presume to know your feelings or to make decisions for you. You've had enough of men telling you what your future will be. And if I were to speak of it, she asked, heart fluttering with newfound boldness. If I were to say that I've come to care for you, in these few days we've known each other. A slow smile spread across his face. Then I would say that I've felt the same, from the moment I found you hiding behind that wagon in your torn wedding dress. He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. But Clara, I wouldn't ask you to decide anything now. When we reach Fort Smith, when you're truly free from Green, then you can consider what you want for your future with no pressure from anyone, including me. His consideration for her choices, so different from how her father or Walter Green had treated her, only deepened her growing feelings for him. You're a good man, Bryce Yates, she said softly. They sat together by the fire until the camp quieted for the night, speaking of their pasts, their families, their hopes. Clara told him of her childhood on a small ranch in Colorado, of her mother's death when she was 14, and how her father's gambling had gradually eroded their security and happiness. Bryce spoke of growing up on the ranch, of learning the cattle business from his father, of his dreams to expand their operation someday. In those quiet hours, something deepened between them, a foundation of understanding and respect upon which stronger feelings could safely build. Morning came too soon. Clara was awakened by Yellow Bird, who brought her a breakfast of dried meat and berries before helping her prepare for the journey ahead. The buckskin dress was replaced with a more practical outfit for riding: soft leather trousers and a loose shirt, with moccasins that were far more comfortable than the borrowed boots she'd been wearing. Bryce was already saddling the horses when she emerged, looking refreshed and determined. Black Hawk and two other warriors would accompany them part of the way to Fort Smith, ensuring they avoided Green's searching parties. Chief Red Cloud approached as they prepared to depart. My son tells me the white man who hunts you is powerful, he said to Clara. But power used to harm others brings only suffering to all. Your people have shown me great kindness, Clara replied. I won't forget it. The chief nodded and turned to Bryce. Protect her well, she has strong spirit. I know, Bryce said simply, and I will. With final farewells to the people who had sheltered them, they set off, following Black Hawk along hidden trails that wound through the most rugged parts of the territory. They traveled swiftly but cautiously, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or eat a quick meal of dried provisions. By nightfall, they had covered an impressive distance. The Cheyenne warriors built a small, nearly smokeless fire in a sheltered ravine, and they all gathered around it to eat and rest. One more day, Black Hawk told them. Then you reach Fort Smith. Clara felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. Fort Smith represented safety and legal freedom from Walter Green, but it also meant decisions about her future would need to be made. As if reading her thoughts, Bryce moved to sit beside her. Are you worried about tomorrow? He asked quietly. A little, she admitted. What if the judge won't grant the annulment? What if Green has friends in Fort Smith who warn him where we've gone? We'll face whatever comes, Bryce assured her. Together. The simple promise comforted her more than elaborate reassurances would have. She leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his steady presence. The night passed peacefully, and they were on the move again before dawn. Black Hawk pushed the pace, aware that Green's men were still searching the territory. By midday, they had reached a point where they could see Fort Smith in the distance, a cluster of buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, with the American flag flying above the largest structure. We leave you here, Black Hawk said. Not safe for Cheyenne near Fort. Bryce clasped the warrior's hand in gratitude. We owe you our lives. If you ever need anything from the Yates Ranch, you have only to ask. Black Hawk nodded solemnly. Take care of Eagle Woman, he said, using the name the old grandmother had given Clara. She has good heart. With that, the Cheyenne warriors turned their ponies and disappeared back into the rugged landscape, leaving Bryce and Clara to approach Fort Smith alone. As they rode toward the settlement, Clara felt her anxiety mounting. What do we do first when we arrive? She asked. Find Judge Parker, Bryce replied. He usually holds court in the morning, so with luck, he might still be at the courthouse. If not, we'll secure lodgings for the night and see him first thing tomorrow. The fort was busier than Clara had expected, with wagons and riders coming and going through the main gates. No one paid particular attention to them as they entered, just another couple arriving from the wilderness, dusty and travel-worn. They made their way to the courthouse, a substantial wooden building near the center of the fort. A clerk informed them that Judge Parker was indeed still present, reviewing cases for the following day. Tell him it's an urgent matter regarding a forced marriage, Bryce requested. Please. The clerk disappeared into the judge's chambers and returned moments later. Judge Parker will see you now, he said, looking somewhat surprised at the quick response. Isaac Parker was a formidable figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a full beard and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. He sat behind a massive desk, various legal documents spread before him. I understand you have a matter of some urgency, he said without preamble. Please state your case. Clara stepped forward, determined to speak for herself. My name is Clara Edwards, Your Honor. 4 days ago, I was forced to marry Walter Green, a cattle baron from Sweetwater, to settle my father's gambling debts. I fled immediately after the ceremony before the marriage could be consummated. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Walter Green, you say? I know of him. A powerful man in the territory. He turned his attention to Bryce. And you are Bryce Yates, Your Honor. My family gave Miss Edwards sanctuary when she fled. Green threatened our ranch and has men searching for her now. Judge Parker steepled his fingers, considering. Marriage under duress is not legally binding, Miss Edwards, but I'll need more than your word to grant an annulment, especially against a man of Green's standing. Do you have any evidence of coercion? My father would testify, I believe, Clara said, though she was far from certain. And Mrs. Bertha Yates witnessed my condition when I arrived at their ranch in a torn wedding dress. Neither of whom is present, the judge pointed out. Clara's heart sank. They had come all this way, risked so much, only to be thwarted by legal requirements. However, Judge Parker continued, surprising her, I have dealt with Mr. Green in the past and found him to be morally flexible, and I have a particular distaste for forced marriages. He reached for a blank sheet of paper. I will issue a temporary stay, preventing Green from claiming his marital rights until a formal hearing can be held. In the meantime, Miss Edwards will remain a ward of this court. Relief flooded through Clara. It wasn't a full annulment, but it was protection. When will the hearing be, Your Honor? Bryce asked. 2 weeks hence, the judge replied, writing rapidly. Time enough for witnesses to be summoned. I suggest you send for Mrs. Yates and anyone else who can corroborate Miss Edwards's account. And where will Miss Edwards stay during this time? Bryce inquired, his concern evident. Judge Parker looked up, his expression softening slightly. There is a boarding house for respectable women run by my sister-in-law, Mrs. Harrington. Miss Edwards will be safe there until the hearing. He finished writing and affixed his seal to the document. This stay is now in effect. Should Mr. Green appear in Fort Smith, he will be legally barred from approaching you, Miss Edwards. Thank you, Your Honor, Clara said, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As they left the courthouse, Clara turned to Bryce, overwhelmed with gratitude and other deeper emotions. You did it, she said softly. You got me to Fort Smith safely, just as you promised. We did it, he corrected, taking her hand. I couldn't have made it through Cheyenne Territory without you. They stood there in the dusty street, hands clasped, the future uncertain but no longer terrifying. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The 2 weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most enlightening of Clara's life. Mrs. Harrington's boarding house proved to be a haven of feminine solidarity, a place where women from various backgrounds supported each other and shared their stories. Clara learned that her situation, while dire, was far from unique. Many of the boarders had escaped difficult or abusive circumstances, finding refuge in Fort Smith under Judge Parker's protective jurisdiction. Bryce secured lodging at a nearby hotel but visited daily, bringing news from the ranch, relayed via telegraph, and accompanying Clara on walks around the fort. Their relationship deepened during these peaceful days, free from the immediate threat of pursuit. They spoke of everything and nothing: childhood memories, favorite books, dreams for the future, building a connection that went far beyond their shared adventure. 5 days before the scheduled hearing, Mrs. Yates arrived in Fort Smith, bringing with her sworn statements from Benjamin Yates and several ranch hands who had witnessed Green's threatening behavior. Her presence was a comfort to Clara, who had come to regard the older woman as something of a surrogate mother. The ranch is secure, Mrs. Yates assured them over dinner at the hotel restaurant. Benjamin has enough men to discourage any further threats from Green, and public opinion has turned against him. Word of his forcing a young woman into marriage has spread throughout the territory. Has there been any news of my father? Clara asked hesitantly. Mrs. Yates's expression grew troubled. I'm afraid so, dear. According to gossip in Sweetwater, he's deeply in debt again, this time to the saloon owner. It seems he's been drinking heavily since you left. Clara sighed, pained but not surprised. Her father had been spiraling downward for years, and she had enabled his self-destruction by managing the household and making excuses for his behavior. Part of her felt guilty for abandoning him, but a stronger part recognized that she couldn't sacrifice her life to his weaknesses. I should visit him, she said finally. After the hearing, whatever he's done, he's still my father. Bryce covered her hand with his. If that's what you want, I'll take you to Sweetwater. His unwavering support touched her deeply. Thank you. The day before the hearing, an unexpected visitor arrived at Mrs. Harrington's boarding house, Sheriff Matthews from Sweetwater. Clara received him in the parlor, with Mrs. Harrington present as a chaperone. Miss Edwards, the sheriff greeted her, hat in hand. I've come on a matter concerning your father and Mr. Green. Clara's heart raced with apprehension. Has something happened? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Your father was killed 3 nights ago in a dispute at the Golden Nugget Saloon. Witnesses say he accused Walter Green of cheating at cards. Green's foreman, a man named Dirk, shot him. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Though she had long since recognized her father's flaws, his death hit her hard, especially learning that it was connected to Green. "I'm very sorry," Sheriff Matthews continued. "I know you and your father had your differences, but no one deserves to die like that. I've arrested Dirk, but he claims self-defense and most witnesses support his version of events." "And Green?" Bryce asked, having entered the room during the sheriff's explanation. "Left town the morning after it happened," Matthews replied. "Said he was heading to Fort Smith on business." Clara and Bryce exchanged alarmed glances. "Green coming to Fort Smith just before the hearing couldn't be a coincidence. Sheriff," Clara said urgently, "Walter Green forced me to marry him. Judge Parker has issued a stay preventing him from approaching me until a formal hearing tomorrow." Matthews nodded. "I suspected as much, which is partly why I came. Your father said some things before he died about selling you to settle his debts. It didn't sit right with me." He straightened. "I'll testify at your hearing, Miss Edwards. What Green did wasn't right, and I won't stand by while he tries to claim you like property." His support was unexpected but welcome. After the sheriff departed, Clara sat in stunned silence, trying to process the news of her father's death and the implications of Green's journey to Fort Smith. "He's coming for me," she said finally. "He knows about the hearing and wants to stop it." "Judge Parker's stay protects you," Bryce reminded her, "and Green wouldn't dare violate a direct court order. It would undermine his position entirely." Clara wasn't so sure. Men like Walter Green believed themselves above the law, especially in frontier territories where legal authority was often tenuous at best. But she kept her fears to herself, not wanting to worry Bryce further. That night, unable to sleep, Clara sat by her window at the boarding house, watching the quiet streets of Fort Smith. Somewhere in this settlement, Walter Green might already be planning his next move. The thought sent a chill through her despite the warm night air. A soft knock at her door startled her. She wrapped a shawl around her nightdress and opened it to find Mrs. Yates standing there, a concerned expression on her face. "I thought you might be having trouble sleeping," the older woman said. "May I come in?" Clara nodded gratefully and ushered her inside. They sat together on the edge of the bed, as they had done during Clara's first nights at the ranch when nightmares had plagued her. "You're worried about tomorrow," Mrs. Yates observed. "I'm afraid," Clara admitted. "Not just of Green, but of what happens after. My father is gone, my home is lost, I have nowhere to go." Mrs. Yates took her hand. "You have somewhere, Clara, you have us. Bertha, Benjamin, and especially Bryce, you must know how my son feels about you." Clara smiled faintly. "He's been careful not to pressure me. He says I should make my own choices now." "That sounds like Bryce," Mrs. Yates chuckled. "Always worried about doing the right thing, even when it means denying what he wants most." She squeezed Clara's hand. "But sometimes, dear, the bravest choice a woman can make is to accept love when it's freely offered." The wisdom of those words stayed with Clara through the night and into the morning of the hearing. As she dressed in her best outfit, a simple but elegant blue dress that Mrs. Harrington had helped her acquire, she felt a strange, calm settle over her. Whatever happened today, she would face it with the knowledge that she was not alone. The courthouse was crowded when they arrived. Word of the case had spread throughout Fort Smith, drawing spectators eager to witness the confrontation between a young woman and one of the territory's most powerful men. And there he was, Walter Green, seated near the front of the room, his expensive suit and confident posture a stark contrast to most of the rough-hewn settlers present. He turned as Clara entered, his cold eyes finding hers across the room. The possessive hunger in his gaze made her shudder. Bryce, standing protectively at her side, noticed her reaction. "He can't touch you," he murmured reassuringly. "Not here, not ever again." They took their seats at the plaintiff's table, joined by Sheriff Matthews and Mrs. Yates. On the defense side, Green sat with a well-dressed man whom Clara assumed was his lawyer. Judge Parker entered, and the room rose. Clara felt a surge of gratitude for this imposing man who had granted her protection when she most needed it. "Be seated," the judge ordered. "We are here to determine the validity of a marriage contracted between Walter Green and Clara Edwards on the 15th day of June, 1875. Miss Edwards contends that she was forced into this union against her will to satisfy gambling debts incurred by her father, now deceased. Mr. Green maintains that the marriage is legal and binding. He surveyed the room sternly. I will hear evidence from both parties and render my judgment accordingly. Green's lawyer spoke first, presenting the marriage certificate signed by the preacher in Sweetwater and arguing that Clara had said her vows willingly in front of multiple witnesses. Did any of these witnesses report Miss Edwards being coerced? Judge Parker interrupted. Your Honor, the ceremony proceeded normally, the lawyer replied smoothly. If Miss Edwards had objections, she should have raised them then, not fled like a thief in the night. Clara flinched at the characterization, but Judge Parker seemed unimpressed by the argument. Continue, he said dryly. When Green himself took the stand, he portrayed himself as a generous benefactor who had saved Clara's family from ruin, only to be repaid with ingratitude and public humiliation. I offered her a comfortable life as the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the territory, he said, his voice dripping with affected hurt. Instead, she chose to run away with a common cowboy, bringing shame on herself and on me. Clara's attorney provided by Judge Parker countered by calling Sheriff Matthews to the stand. Sheriff, did Jacob Edwards ever speak to you about his daughter's marriage? The attorney asked. He did, sir, Matthews confirmed. The night he died, Edwards was drunk and bitter. He said, and I quote, "Sold my girl to that devil Green for the price of my debts. May God forgive me, for she never will." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Green's face darkened with anger. Mrs. Yates testified next, describing Clara's condition upon arriving at the ranch distraught, her wedding dress torn, terrified of being found by Green's men. In my 60 years, she concluded firmly, I have never seen a willing bride in such a state. Throughout the testimonies, Clara sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to project a dignity she didn't entirely feel. When it was finally her turn to speak, she approached the witness stand with trepidation, but determined to tell her story truthfully. Miss Edwards, her attorney began gently, please tell the court how your marriage to Mr. Green came about. Clara took a deep breath. My father lost heavily at cards to Mr. Green. When he couldn't pay, Mr. Green said he would take our ranch unless my father offered me instead. I learned of this arrangement only 2 weeks before the wedding. Did you consent to this marriage? I objected strenuously, Clara replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. But my father said we would lose everything if I refused. On the day of the wedding, one of Mr. Green's men stood behind my father during the ceremony. I understood the implied threat. And after the ceremony, I said the words the preacher required, but in my heart, I made no vow. When everyone was celebrating afterward, I slipped away. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and that's when Mr. Yates found me hiding behind a wagon. Green's lawyer rose for cross-examination. Miss Edwards, isn't it true that you've been living unchaperoned with Mr. Yates for the past 2 weeks? That the two of you fled together on horseback? Objection, Clara's attorney called. Miss Edwards's actions after fleeing a forced marriage are not relevant to whether the marriage itself was coerced. Sustained, Judge Parker ruled. Confine your questions to the matter at hand, counselor. Green's lawyer changed tactics. Miss Edwards, did you ever explicitly tell your father you would not marry Mr. Green? Yes, Clara said firmly, many times. And yet you went through with the ceremony, you said the vows, with a gun at my father's back, Clara replied, her voice shaking slightly. What choice did I have? The questioning continued for nearly an hour, Green's lawyer trying to undermine her testimony while Clara struggled to maintain her composure. Finally, Judge Parker intervened. I believe we've heard enough, he said. Miss Edwards, you may step down. As a final witness, Bryce testified about finding Clara in her torn wedding dress, confirming her immediate claim that she had been forced into marriage. When all testimony concluded, Judge Parker called for closing arguments. Green's lawyer emphasized the legal formality of the marriage and insinuated that Clara had simply changed her mind after meeting Bryce. Clara's attorney countered by focusing on the element of coercion, arguing that no marriage contracted under duress could be considered valid under either law or moral principle. After the arguments concluded, Judge Parker announced he would retire to his chambers to consider his ruling. The wait was agonizing. Clara sat between Bryce and Mrs. Yates, drawing strength from their presence while avoiding Green's cold stare from across the room. When Judge Parker returned an hour later, the courtroom fell silent. "Having heard the evidence presented," he began, "I find that the marriage between Walter Green and Clara Edwards was indeed contracted under duress. The testimony of Sheriff Matthews regarding Jacob Edwards's deathbed confession is particularly compelling, as are the circumstances of Miss Edwards's flight immediately following the ceremony." Clara felt tears of relief forming in her eyes as the judge continued. "According to the laws of this territory and the moral principles upon which our society is founded, no marriage can be valid without the free consent of both parties. I therefore declare this marriage null and void, as if it had never taken place." A cheer erupted from the spectators, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Furthermore," Judge Parker added, his gaze fixed on Green, "I find Mr. Green's behavior in this matter reprehensible. Using financial leverage to force a young woman into marriage is contrary to all principles of decency. While not technically illegal, it certainly merits public censure." Green stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage. I paid good money for that woman." "And with those words, sir, you confirm the court's finding," Judge Parker said coldly. "Miss Edwards is a person, not property to be purchased. You would do well to remember that distinction in future dealings." Green stormed out of the courtroom, followed by his lawyer. Clara hardly noticed his departure, so overwhelming was her relief at the judge's ruling. She was free, truly free, for perhaps the first time in her life. Outside the courthouse, well-wishers surrounded them, many of the women from Mrs. Harrington's boarding house among them. Sheriff Matthews approached to offer his congratulations before heading back to Sweetwater. "What will you do now, Miss Edwards?" he asked kindly. It was the question she had been pondering all along. With her father dead and her childhood home likely lost to his debts, she had no obvious place to return to. But as she looked at Bryce, standing patiently nearby while she spoke with the sheriff, she realized that home had taken on a new meaning for her. "I'm not entirely sure," she told the sheriff honestly, "but I won't be returning to Sweetwater." After the crowd dispersed, Bryce, Clara, and Mrs. Yates walked back to the boarding house together. The older woman, sensing that the younger pair needed time alone, excused herself to rest before dinner. Bryce and Clara continued to the small garden behind Mrs. Harrington's establishment, a quiet spot with a bench beneath a flowering apple tree. There, with the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves above them, they sat in companionable silence for several moments. "You're free now," Bryce said finally, "free to choose your own path." Clara nodded, studying his face, the strong features that had become so dear to her in such a short time. "Yes, and I've been thinking about what that path might be." "Have you reached any conclusions?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his hope. "I have," she replied softly. "In the past 2 weeks, I've learned more about myself and what I want from life than in all my 20 years before. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can face danger and uncertainty without breaking." She reached for his hand. "And I've learned that home isn't necessarily where you were born or raised. It can be with people who respect your choices and value your voice." Bryce's fingers tightened around hers. "Clara, are you saying?" "I'm saying that if the offer still stands, I'd like to return to the Yates Ranch. Not as a guest or a refugee this time, but as..." She hesitated, suddenly shy despite her determination. Bryce turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "As what, Clara?" "As your wife," she whispered, "if you'll have me." Joy transformed his face, erasing the careful restraint he had maintained throughout their ordeal. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you since the moment I found you behind that wagon, though I hardly dared admit it even to myself." "Then you'll have me?" she asked, tears of happiness threatening to spill from her eyes. "For all my days," he promised. Then, with the gentleness that had first drawn her to him, he leaned forward and kissed her their first kiss, sweet and tender and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, Clara felt a certainty she had never known before. This man, this kind, honorable cowboy who had risked everything to help a stranger, was where her future lay. "There's the matter of a proper courtship," Bryce said, ever mindful of propriety despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Clara laughed, the sound light and free. "I think we're rather beyond conventional courtship, don't you? We've fled across the wilderness together, shared a camp with Cheyenne warriors, and faced down one of the most powerful men in the territory." Bryce smiled, acknowledging the truth of her words. "Even so, I'd like to do things right. When we return to the ranch, with your permission, I'll speak to my father about our intentions. And then, when you're ready, whether that's a month from now or a year, we'll marry. Your choice, your timing." "I don't need a year," Clara said with certainty. "I know my own mind now." Their return journey to the Yates Ranch was considerably less eventful than their flight to Fort Smith had been. With no need for secrecy or haste, they traveled by stagecoach for much of the way, Mrs. Yates accompanying them as both chaperone and companion. Arriving back at the ranch felt like coming home. Benjamin Yates greeted them with uncharacteristic emotion, embracing his wife and son before turning to Clara with a warm smile. "Judge Parker's ruling reached us by telegraph," he told her. "I'm glad justice was done." "As am I," Clara replied. "And grateful beyond words for all your family has done for me." That evening, after supper, Bryce asked his father to join them in the parlor. With Clara seated beside him, her hand in his, he formally announced their intention to marry. Benjamin's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Can't say I'm surprised," he remarked dryly. "Your mother's been planning the wedding since the day you brought Clara home." "Father," Bryce protested, though Clara couldn't help laughing. "Well, it was obvious to anyone with eyes," Mrs. Yates defended herself, entering the room in time to hear her husband's comment. "The way you two looked at each other from the very beginning." Perhaps they were right, Clara reflected. Perhaps something had been there from that first moment, a recognition, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect autumn day with the aspen trees turning gold against the Wyoming sky. It was a simple ceremony, held in the ranch yard with a circuit-riding preacher officiating. Neighbors from surrounding ranches attended, as did several of the Cheyenne who had helped them on their journey to Fort Smith. Black Hawk, among them, honored guests at the celebration. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk, ordered from Denver and far more to her taste than the elaborate satin gown of her first, invalid wedding. Her hair was adorned with wildflowers gathered by the younger Yates children, and her heart was full as she walked toward Bryce, who waited for her beneath an arch twined with autumn leaves and late-blooming roses. This time, when she spoke her vows, they came from her heart, freely given, freely chosen. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was a promise of all the days to come. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with feasting and dancing and many toasts to the happiness of the bride and groom. As sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Bryce led Clara away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Very," she assured him, leaning into his embrace, "though it still feels strange to have a new name." "You'll always be Clara to me," he said softly. "The brave woman who chose her own path against all odds." She turned in his arms to face him. "With your help, I'll never forget what you said to me that first day when I told you they had forced me to marry Green." "What did I say?" Bryce asked, genuinely trying to recall his exact words. "You said, then you'll choose for yourself from now on," Clara reminded him. "And I have. I've chosen you, Bryce Yates. Every day I choose you." He kissed her then, with all the tenderness and passion that had grown between them through danger and hardship, and finally, joyously, into love. As they walked back toward the celebration hand in hand, Clara looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Her path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led her here to freedom, to family, to a love that respected her choices and celebrated her strength. And in the end, what more could any woman ask for? Years later, when their own daughter asked how they had met, Bryce and Clara would exchange a knowing look before telling a somewhat gentled version of their story. They would speak of courage and kindness, of standing against injustice, of finding love in unexpected circumstances. And always, they would emphasize the importance of choosing one's own path, a lesson their children and grandchildren would carry forward into a new century, where women's choices would gradually, painfully expand beyond what Clara could have imagined in that summer of 1875. On their 25th wedding anniversary, with their 3 children grown and the ranch thriving under their joint stewardship, Bryce presented Clara with a gift, a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his recollections of their journey together. "So we never forget," he said simply. Clara, her chestnut hair now streaked with silver but her blue eyes as bright as ever, opened it to find their story written in Bryce's careful hand. On the first page was a sentence that brought tears to her eyes. She said they forced her to marry him. "I said she would choose for herself from now on, and every day since, I have been grateful that she chose me."